Welcome to this evening's Yakety Yak. I'm Peter Shergold, the head of the Centre for Social Impact, and tonight's event is hosted by the Macquarie Group Foundation. This evening's guest is known, I think, to all of us as a prolific food writer and erstwhile famous restaurateur. She's also renowned for the contribution that she's made to the hospitality and tourism industries in Australia. Perhaps less well known is the extraordinary energy she's brought to a not-for-profit organisation, the Kitchen Garden Foundation. And I think that's what we're going to hear much of this evening. So please welcome Stephanie Alexander and the interlocutor, as always, Peter Thompson.
Well, good evening. It was lovely last year. I had the privilege last year of being MC, I suppose is the best way of putting it, of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year Awards. And it was a privilege to be able to announce that Stephanie had won the Victorian Social Entrepreneur of the Year Award, which really was testament to the great idea that you've developed and worked up, and it's now blooming, the Kitchen Garden Foundation. So it was lovely to be able to do that with you. And Stephanie had been a guest on Talking Heads a couple of years ago. So what I thought we'd do in the half hour is talk a bit about the Kitchen Garden Foundation, talk a little about her life and how she came to this, and then also it's of interest to a group like this of people from social enterprises and social entrepreneurs and philanthropic organisations, plus the Centre for Social Impact, to talk about some of the structures involved in putting together such a thing as the Kitchen Garden Foundation. So you're now nearly up to 200.
138, but applications close for round 3 of funding on Friday. So we're fairly confident that we'll be administering a further 40 to 50 schools in a few months.
So it's a long way from Collingwood College.
2001, we've come a long way since then. I agree. It's been a huge and very rapid expansion.
You've said that if you'd realised how hard it would be, how long it would take, that you might have thought differently about it. Has it been different from some of your other great involvements? Like, you know, obviously everyone in this room knows about Stephanie's restaurant.
Well, I guess I'm a very impatient person, and I like to feel that results happen. And this has been my first experience of working with government partners, working with where it has been very, very necessary to cross every T, dot every I, write lots of reports, deal with bureaucracy, deal with committees, deal with agendas, minutes, balance sheets. Some of those things, yes, I dealt with in the restaurant world, but it's been very rigorous for me, and it's forced me to slow down a bit and to, fortunately, we have Ange Barry, our wonderful CEO, who excels in all of those areas, so I can still wave my hands around a bit. But it's been very interesting, and I must say I've actually enjoyed the experience of working with government and getting close to people who I feel really are receptive to ideas.
It's a very different thing from having a good idea to actually allowing yourself to be swept up into it to the extent of really putting your shoulder to the wheel in the way you have.
Very different.
The good idea really was saying, was motivated by concerns about children and they're not knowing where their food came from, wasn't it?
It was also motivated by my annoyance at the type of interventions that had been proposed by government up to this point, in the sense that we had a universal understanding that there was a problem with what young children were eating, and there was a universal understanding of what people foreshadowed as being the implications of this, both financial and health-wise. But all that was being proposed to children were really negative, cautionary messages, people wagging their finger at them saying, don't eat this, don't eat salt, don't eat fat. And
the food pyramid thing.
I think Blind Freddy could have told anyone who was really interested or knew anything about a child that those sort of messages were extremely uncool and very uninteresting.
They were part of the education curriculum, weren't they? There was attention given to nutrition.
Things came out, like a pamphlet or a guideline or the pyramid, or talk about food groups. And I just got enraged about this because I knew this was not the way to change behaviour, and I knew, because of my own life and because I think of straight common sense, that children do things that are enjoyable. They learn through doing, and it is so much more useful to find a way of engaging kids' energy, their curiosity, their sense of fun, their enjoyment of being with their friends, and we did all that. The way to do all that with food was to allow the children to actually get into the garden, grow some food, pick the food, come into the kitchen, learn how to cook it, and then sit around a table with other people and enjoy what they'd made and talk about it. And it works.
You'd had no previous experience whatsoever, though, with sort of a social enterprise of this sort, had you?
None.
So where was the tipping point between thinking, that's a great idea, that ought to happen, and thinking, I'm going to do this?
Well, I suppose I probably didn't see the implications. I wanted to try out this idea. So
We never do.
You never do. And I was led by a slightly curvy path to the then principal of Collingwood College, who, as I often say, I believe was receptive to this idea because she was Italian, and she did believe that eating well and understanding about where food comes from is a very important part of a joyful life. She also saw that many of the students at that school had appalling eating habits and came to school without breakfast and with a litre bottle of Coke, and that was sustenance for the day. And she knew that something had to change. And so when I came along and said, are you interested in trying out this theory? She said, well, yes, let's give it a go. And she also would say she had no idea what she was letting herself in for, because very, very soon, within months, money came up. I hadn't really thought that this, hadn't thought it through at all. I hadn't really grasped. I got in there and everybody got in there. We dug up the asphalt, we built a garden. That was fairly easy to do. And we got some help. And the school itself had a very old home economics classroom because it was what's known as a P to 12, which meant that there was a space in the school that was already a kitchen. It was a horrible kitchen, it was dirty and it was old and it was unused. We made it beautiful, so off we went. We employed a kitchen specialist. So the school had obviously put their hand up and said they would pay for that salary. She was only there 2 days a week. But within the first hour, she said, I can't do this on my own. I've got to have somebody else to help. The 25 children, absolutely full of excitement and roaring around the place with knives and knives and fire. And we thought, well, yes, volunteers have got to come into this. And so, reality slowly seeped in, and we realised that this model needed to be adjusted. And I guess we've gone on doing that. We've gone on adjusting our model by observing very closely how it's being applied, by understanding where the problems lie and refining what we do. We've produced a lot of wonderful, helpful, supportive material now for our 138 schools, and I think we've got a pretty good idea now what works and what doesn't work. And of course, we've just had an evaluation from Melbourne University announced last week, which is fantastic for us, because whilst I might say I always knew it was going to work, I'm very aware that those who have the purse strings need evidence, and they've now got it.
If I were in your shoes, I would have thought at Collingwood, well, others will see the benefit of this and do it themselves, rather than you have to form an institution to actually replicate this, scale it up.
Well, it does sit slightly outside the structures in the existing primary school, and I think it did need a driver. It did need me to endlessly talk about it, endlessly go and discuss it with not only politicians but with philanthropic organisations, with service clubs, with local communities, because it was a fantastic way, and I could see it was a fantastic way for a school to draw in friends from its wider community. The school, they're very busy people in schools, and they don't have a lot of time to develop something completely outside what they're used to doing. So I think we had to find a way of making that seem possible for schools, and that meant that they should be able to see there was support there. And also that delivering classes or sessions, if you like, in the garden and in the kitchen, these people are not teachers. So they're employed and chosen because of their passion, because of their interest in young kids, and because they really know how to garden or they really know how to cook. So the responsibility of the school is to make sure that the classroom teacher is with the children at all times for legal reasons, but the school still has to find the resources to pay the salaries of these part-time people. So it isn't for every school.
As you talk, I can hear very much we'll come back to this because I want to pick up some of the threads that we've started to sow there. I better than ever before, I've had this sense of you're very much the product of your parents.
Mm.
Firstly, your mother's love of food.
Yes. My mother's love of food and my own upbringing from the time I can remember, which was always understanding that food represented culture and it represented the broadest possible understanding of the way the world operated. And she liked to bring that into the home. And so from the time I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, I was hearing every night, this is the way that this is cooked in Poland, or this is a Czech dish, or this is da-da-da-da, because it's just something she loved to do. So I knew that food was more than just fuel, always.
She was a frustrated artist, and I think you wrote about her at one stage that she made her life's work the art of food, because she had 4 children to provide for. Plus,
she did. And plus, I think she was a very early tree changer, and she was quite a romantic person, and she was lucky that my father was intensely practical, because otherwise anything could have happened, because she really rather fancied keeping bees and milking a cow. She never milked a cow in her life, you know, and chickens, ducks, all that sort of stuff. But she managed to do most of it, and he sort of was there to sort of be a support for some of the more practical aspects of these things.
the things he did, I mean, one of the things he did was he ran a commercial library. And I'd sort of forgotten the fact that libraries were commercial.
Well, until my father was part of the first committee for the free library service movement in Victoria, and because the model had been established in the UK, and he firmly believed that every person should have access to a library. But before that had happened, the only way people got library books, were able to borrow books, was to join a circulating library, for which they would pay 6pence or 3pence or something every time they wanted to take out a book. But he was particularly interested in Australian history, so his first library, which was in Ballarat, had an amazing collection of Australian literature. And then he had another library in Ascot Vale after he and my mother were married. And that collection of early Australian literature was priceless, and it's one of the tragedies of my life that it was dispersed.
So you would have become a librarian, as it turned out. But one of the things, your father being a librarian, he was a great lover of home movies. And this was a wonderful gift to Talking Heads, because Stephanie would say, well, my mother would cook for us, and you would see authentic shots from the home movies of Stephanie's mother cooking and sort of taking things in and out of the oven and bringing them to table. And everything is catalogued. It's a most extraordinary family. And one thing which is catalogued is the kitchen, the dining table was a real place of exchange and debate. And Uncle Wilfred, your mother is Mary Burchett, Wilfred Burchett, her brother.
No, Dad's brother.
Oh, your dad's brother.
Yeah.
Is seen fulminating at the table. Now, there might be people in this room that don't know about Wilfred Burchett, so you better explain.
Well, he was a journalist, and he was very controversial in Australia at a certain point in time. It would have to be said, historically, Australia at the time was slightly blinkered in its view of the world, and Wilfred believed in the people's revolutions, and he always reported conflict from the side that was not the official Australian side during the long years of the Menzies government. So
he was to Australia what Jane Fonda was to
probably
America during the Vietnam War.
And people have eventually calmed down and realised that there was a legitimate other side to a lot of these debates.
His passport was taken away, wasn't it?
His passport was stolen, we believe.
And then not
and returned by Whitlam as one of the first things in the Whitlam government. So that was quite a dramatic member of the family, and there were lots and lots of implications from all of that. It was a very nasty time in Australian society during the 50s, and there was a lot of xenophobia, a lot of, you know, reds under the bed. And my father, who was horrified by any sort of dogma of whatever sort, but still supported his brother because he believed that he had the right to write as he saw, the truth as he saw it. But he did suffer a lot himself in a small country town.
What did you take from that family sort of
Well,
environment?
incredible tolerance. I think one of the strongest things that my father has always said was that nothing and no one is ever as bad or as good as they first appear. And
like
I
that.
think that's often been helpful to me when I've had staffing crises.
I don't know about on the bad side.
So that he found it very almost impossible to take an absolute point of view. He would always say, and what about the other side? And what do you think from the other side? And so the family dinner table was often very volatile because my grandfather, who lived with us, was an absolutely rabid madman in many ways, and he'd moved from being a sort of a Methodist lay preacher to now being absolutely polarised in the other direction. And so we had Dad trying to be reasonable, Grandpa fulminating, Mother twittering around and getting anxious, the children slamming doors and leaving the table. So it was quite... In between, we had beautiful food.
Now, you used to harbour the illusion that everyone else lived like this.
But they didn't.
Yes. I mean, that was a wake-up for you, wasn't it?
It was a wake-up for me, and it was a very small... I lived in West Rosebud, and in those days West Rosebud was the deep countryside. There was nothing, a general store and a post office.
100 k's away.
Well, it was 100 k's away, and it wasn't until... And the high school was very small, and my final year at school there were only 6 students in the year, and I was the only girl. So I really was cut off completely from peer friendships, and most of the study I did was through correspondence. So it was not ideal in many, many ways. But it wasn't until I then went to university that I came into the world of young women of my own age. Many of them had grown up in the country also. They'd come to live in residential college at university. And it was at that point that I realised that the culinary background that I had had and the broad political understanding that I had was entirely foreign to almost 99.9% of the girls that I then met. It was a big shock. Big shock.
Well, you were thinking about... You weren't so sure about being a high school teacher or a teacher. You weren't
Didn't want to be
so
a teacher.
inclined.
Didn't want to be a teacher.
So...
Funny that I've sort of...
So librarianship became
Well,
the thing.
librarianship, because I think in those days the options were very few. If you were you did an arts degree at Melbourne University, what did you do? You could be a teacher, you could be a librarian. Not quite sure what else you would have done. You got married. That's what a lot of girls did. They got married and they didn't take up anything very seriously. And I was a very happy librarian, I might add, for 10 years. I mean, I really enjoyed it, and I do love all that order and system.
And you can see it by picking up a book like The Cook's Companion. The order and system is all there. I mean,
That's right,
it's
nothing
this
like
is
A to Z.
Yeah. Right. You love France. You went to France really as a young woman. Went to England. You worked for the BBC as a librarian.
In their library.
You met Monty.
Yes.
So he was to change your life.
He was, and I had the business about being in the professional food world. It just had never occurred to me, and I don't think it had ever occurred to my parents that one would even contemplate such a thing. And it wasn't until Monty and I met and we married and had made up our mind that we were going to come and live in Australia, and we had to sort of sort out what he thought he might do, because he didn't really have very many skills, but he was particularly interested in business, and he thought he'd like to import goods, food, from the West Indies into Australia. And I mean, he also had this fantasy notion that it would all be easy, and I said to him, well, we'll have to have a coffee lounge, because that's what you did in the 60s. You had a coffee lounge. There was no such thing as BYO legislation at that point. So that's when Jamaica House started, and that was my first introduction to the world of hospitality, which went on for me for another 35 years. with a couple of gaps.
And Jamaica House didn't last long, it lasted a few
Well,
years.
Jamaica House did last a long time, but my involvement in Jamaica House really finished just after two and a half years when we separated, and we'd had a pretty hectic time in those couple of years with being all the things that you shouldn't be in small business, undercapitalised, no idea what you're doing, a hole in the floor, a 3-week-old baby. You know, there were a few things that were making it very difficult. But the business itself went on into various incarnations long after Monty died.
Then along comes Stephanie's Restaurant, firstly at Fitzroy,
yes,
then at Hawthorne.
Brunswick Street, which was like a desert. There was nothing in Brunswick Street other than about 3 shops and Mietta's up the other end near the football ground. And in between was darkness. And at night it really was darkness. It was quite different. And so I can't quite believe Brunswick Street now. But so we were 4 years in Brunswick Street, and then we moved to Hawthorne. And in every one of these ventures and adventures, my father definitely either lent money or guaranteed loans. I mean, he was always prepared to believe in me, which really is pretty amazing, because I mean, some of the things that I did were silly, to put it mildly. And I think he actually lost some money. I hate to think how much, but...
What was silly?
Well, I mean, things like going into business and you didn't know anything about business, or actually, you know, that's not very
It's
bright.
chicken and egg in a way.
It was easier to do it then, possibly, and certainly you didn't need astronomical sums of money to set up a small restaurant. They seemed astronomical to me at the time. I know that we borrowed $20,000 to start Stephanie's Restaurant in Brunswick Street, which my father guaranteed because we didn't have $20,000. And, well, we just went ahead and did it. And it sort of worked. But it worked by working 16, 17 hours a day.
Well, it became completely institutional and known throughout the country, and just crucial in terms of Melbourne's culinary world. But as you're saying, it exacts a huge toll that business does, that industry does.
And I think it still does. I think it possibly is easier now, and certainly what does seem to happen now is that you find that a lot of very successful restaurateurs have backers, so that they're not actually having to find that money themselves. And look, I don't know how the young people do it, quite frankly, because particularly those that have 3, 4, 5, 6 outlets, don't know. All I know is the only way to do it, which I know how to do, is to roll your sleeves up and get in there and do it yourself. And I've always been a control freak, of course. I've always wanted to be across everything. And I think I'm now realising, perhaps for the first time, that I can't be across everything all the time. Not every day.
Well, in the time you had Stephanie's Restaurant, that sort of parallels exactly a complete change of food culture in Australia, doesn't it?
It does, and it was an amazing and a wonderfully satisfying life from a professional sense. I think there were casualties along the way. I think my children found it quite hard, although it wasn't nearly as bad because we were, for a time, living above the shop, as it were. But it was all-consuming, and it was very hard to find a little squeezy bit of time for friends, for outings, for holidays, downtime. But it was exciting. It was exciting, and all sorts of things were happening in Australia, and I was able to work with producers and suppliers and work with people who were wanting to develop new things as food became more and more interesting to more and more people. And I think more and more Australians in the 70s and 80s, particularly the 80s, were travelling, so that their own horizons were broadening too. When we first started, people used to sort of say, this is so innovative, this is so different, and I used to find that, and still find it, incredibly embarrassing, because I wasn't doing anything innovative at that stage at all. I was just serving lovely French country food. But because it was not known to a lot of people, that was seen as if you were breaking entirely new ground. And it didn't seem to matter how often I said, this is something I tasted in the countryside when I lived in France. It was a big learning curve for Australia.
So growing out of all this experience started to come your books.
yes.
And the Cook's Companion sold over 400,000 copies, and I know you say one of the things that's done is give you some liberation in terms of what you can do.
It's an amazing phenomenon, and you know, I touch wood every day. Wherever it was not it, but anyway,
We'll find
take
some.
it for me. It has given me that financial freedom to be able to say I can now do exactly what I want to do, and this cause, if you like, really has grown out of everything I've done. I didn't just sit down one day and think, I think I'm going to do something now for younger children. I think it was all part of my belief that people really can have their minds and their hearts opened to beautiful food, fresh food, seasonality, and that is the healthiest, most delicious food you could possibly eat. I don't want to describe it in terms of health and good for you and nutritional goodness, all of which is perfectly true, but I still think that that's not the way to get people on to follow. You need to get people to see it's enjoyable, that it adds joy to life, that it adds another dimension, it's a way of understanding the world, and that's how I used to talk to my apprentices. And so they were, 17, 18, and most of them I found had not had that sort of experience again, even though they'd chosen a career in the restaurant world. The majority of them had come from very limited culinary backgrounds, so that it was all new to them too.
In a way, this Kitchen Garden Foundation replicates the experience you had as a child. That
It
is,
does.
you eat a lot of the things that you grow, but that it's not just about growing either.
And
It's
you're open
also
to new
about
experiences,
cooking
I
and
think.
sharing.
And you're open to just finding things for the first time and understanding how they grow. You've put the seed in the ground, you've watched it get to the point where it's ready to pick, and then you find out that you can actually do something with it in the kitchen and turn it into something that you'd never have dreamt of. I have parents who say to me things like, my child doesn't eat anything green. It's an extraordinary thing that a parent says. But anyway, there are parents that say that. And they haven't seen their kids picking the silver beet from the garden, chopping it all up, sautéing it with a bit of garlic and a bit of olive oil, squashing it in with their hands with huge enthusiasm into the ricotta and parmesan, making little cannelloni with the pasta that they've made themselves, sitting down and eating this with huge enthusiasm. And then and these same parents will say, well, they don't eat anything green. If they're being presented with an orange blob and a green blob on the side of a plate, I don't blame them for not eating it. There are better things to do with it.
In terms of the Kitchen Garden Foundation, what are the major practical difficulties with it?
The major practical difficulty, the single practical difficulty that's there are two. Firstly, in primary schools throughout the country, they do not have a kitchen. There's no primary school in Australia, unless it's a private school that's very well endowed, that has a teaching kitchen. So that for schools who apply for funding to us, we say as part of the non-negotiable part of the application, you must have the space in your school, and it can't be a portable classroom because that's not permitted by the Education Department. It has to be a permanent space in your school that you can now convert into a teaching kitchen of the sort that we nominate, which will be sufficiently large so that a whole grade of children, approximately 20 kids, can all work together in the 4 or 5 in a group. They've all got access to a stove, they've all got access to a sink, they've all got bench space, and they've all got somewhere to store their stuff.
What does that cost to put in?
Approximately, well, it can vary. If the space is there, the fit out probably be $30,000. So that's the first big problem. The second big problem, and that's a one-off. Once they've achieved that, and usually their community will come and help them achieve that, and that's can be a very rich and rewarding experience for a school. But the biggest problem is the salaries for these 2 part-time specialists, because that's recurrent. And so that's the holy grail at the moment, dealing with that.
No government funding supports the salaries, is that so?
The funding from the Australian government is for infrastructure only.
Yeah. So that is for the garden outside. Do they help with the kitchen?
Well, it's just a lump sum. The school has, that's all they get.
60,000, isn't it?
60,000, and with that amount of money, they are required to create this kitchen and to create the garden. They will almost certainly have to find extra resources. Many of them have been very creative in the way they've done that, and many of them have had marvellous help from tradespersons, local businesses, all sorts of ways schools have managed to create those spaces.
Which I know this is one of the upsides you feel about the whole program, that it is reaching out to the
Absolutely.
community. It makes the school part of the community.
Yeah, it's been wonderful stories.
Like the local grocer will
Well, the local grocer,
provide food, for example.
he might, or sometimes, and every school does something differently. There's 138 schools. We'd probably find there'd be 138 different ways of meeting these challenges. One of the schools that I know in Victoria puts out a list every week. Next week we're going to be making blah blah blah. Anyone who would like to pick up an extra packet of rice or an extra packet of this, that, and the other, and various mums sometimes will just once a week they'll put in an extra something in their grocery basket and bring it to the school. So that's a way they supplement their dry goods. There are nurserymen in Victoria that have donated 20 bare-rooted fruit trees to each of the first 50 schools in Victoria. I mean, that's an amazing gift. There's so many ways that people can participate, but the salary issue is something that we are continually working on.
And how's that being tackled?
Well, at the moment it's being tackled by the schools out of their global budget, having to commit to fund these two positions. In Victoria, it should be stated that the Victorian state government had a different model for funding. Currently, we've used that funding, and the schools got a much smaller amount of money for infrastructure, but they got $25,000 for each of 2 years towards their salaries. That made a huge difference to the school, and then it would find some of its own funds to make up the difference. The cost of the two specialists on average, and it is an average, is around $60,000 a year. So that's the recurrent funding.
So that's like a full teacher's salary or a bit more, is it?
Yes, yes, approximately.
That's a lot.
It's nothing compared to what we're being told the public health cost of the implications of not doing anything.
Indeed. I wanted to come to that finally, but
Don't ask me to do the sums.
what about a charge on children that are participating?
There are a couple of schools that are putting a levy. That is entirely up to the school if they feel that's the way to do it. We've had, I think the levies are range. Ange would be able to be accurate, so I better not say because I'll get it wrong. But they're not very big.
What is it, Ange?
It's about $2 a week on average they charge, and the cost of the program is roughly $11 a week.
The program's selective too, isn't it? Because there's no room for all the children.
Oh, absolutely. You mean selective in the sense of
Well,
the schools being selected, or within the school?
No, within the school.
No, within the school, every child in grades 3 to 6. So it's an age thing more than anything.
So all
else.
children were aged 3 in years 3 to 6?
Yes,
in years 3 to
those
6.
children are approximately aged 8 to 11. So once they get to grade 3,
So if the school's doing it and they're 8 to 11, they get in the program.
that's it.
Right.
So it's every week for a minimum of 3 years and sometimes 4 years, depending on how the school runs the program. So it's a very big intervention, and we have been shown that it really does change behaviour.
Let's talk for a few minutes, and we'll come to an end soon, about partnerships you've had. For example, the Maya Foundation was one of the groups that actually gave you start-up money. But,
They did.
But like the Victorian government, initial start-up money, those things have expired too.
Yes, the Maya Foundation funded Urunga, which is our school in Wangaratta, and was obviously we were extremely grateful for that, because we really wanted a country school right from the beginning to show that this was not just something that belonged in the suburbs, that we really wanted to show that country schools could do this program well, and Urunga actually has done it extremely well. So we've had some fantastic partnerships.
And what's the hardest thing to interest partnerships in, or foundations who might be able to assist and mobilise resources for you?
Well, I think recurrent funding is very, very difficult for people. I think that our partnerships, our most successful partnerships, have been where we've taken the partners to have a look at a school in action, and that is always 100% more successful than me just chatting. When they go, they're absolutely amazed at what they see, and then we have to try and tailor what it is that they might be able to offer with what we need to make a sort of a good good win-win for everybody.
So from where you are now, where you've got heading towards 200 schools that'll be doing this, it's still a small percentage of the overall number of primary schools.
There are 7,000 approximately primary schools in Australia. So there's a
Long way to go.
Long way to go.
And do you see yourselves as phasing out of this, whilst this actually gets
Well, I
adopted
think
by...
that it's possible. I think that it's possible that, I mean, it really is only a few days since we've had this evaluation report, and we do think that's incredibly important, because what we really feel is that the dream would be that once the program as operating is shown to actually deliver the outcomes that government says it wants, that is, positively influence the way children choose food, then there has to be some discussion about whether this program can be expanded to any school that wishes to give it a go. Now that's obviously huge amounts of money, and we don't know when or if that will happen. But in the meantime, our role is to support the schools that already have this program in as meaningful a way as we can by developing curriculum materials, by offering training to all the specialists wherever they be in Australia, by supporting the schools themselves, by developing a better website so that there's more interaction, so that children can talk to other children. So there's so many things that we want to do to strengthen the program, so we can keep presenting to our partners and to government that this is a very serious organisation that wants to do things professionally and very well.
So have you had time to think about what else ought to be done in terms of, maybe you're not involved in it, but ideas that others might run with that actually would continue the program of change that you're trying to initiate in terms of eating habits and attitudes to food?
You mean other than this program?
Because this, great though it is unlikely by itself to cause a revolution.
It won't cause a revolution, but it will change the way that children eat. That is a revolution. It will cause a revolution. It just has to be supported on a wide enough basis. I believe this is the only thing that will change the way children feel about food. You're not going to frighten them into changing. You've lost the parents because they are hopeless and they don't know. I shouldn't say that, sorry. Many parents are not convinced themselves.
Yeah.
Many parents themselves do not have the skills to easily cook beautiful fresh food. So their children are not getting it at home.
I'm itching to ask you a question, maybe we'll make this the final one. What about MasterChef?
Well, everybody watches it.
2 million people watch it. There's a story in the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald today saying, actually it's in the media section, front page of the media section, saying that big Woolworths, for instance, they do beef stroganoff on MasterChef and sales of beef stroganoff materials go up 40%, 50% following week. I mean, it is, in terms of these as a germ of something that actually might lead to change of attitudes and behaviours.
I wonder how often they make beef stroganoff.
Once.
But it is a social phenomenon.
It is a social phenomenon, and there's no question that the children in our schools are watching it. I would like to suggest that their awareness has been raised already, but nonetheless, whichever school I visit, they say to me, I saw you on MasterChef, I saw you on MasterChef, you know, so we all have a bit of a talk about that. And what I feel that we can say is that they are seeing fresh ingredients turned into food. Now, many of them are not seeing that at home.
Yeah.
So that has to have some sort of subliminal effect. But I am not convinced that is teaching children how to cook.
I was thinking about adults actually, about the parents that you say that you didn't say are hopeless.
Well, I don't know. I think that possibly there's certainly a phenomenon of them then saying, oh, well, I'll go and pick up that recipe card and at whichever supermarket it is and buy the ingredients and give that a go. And that's a good thing. But whether that's going to actually change the parents' behaviour for the longer term, I would query.
Which is in a way part of the beauty of the Kitchen Garden Foundation, that it's not watching something on television, it's practice. It's actually practical, getting your hands dirty, doing the work, forming the habit.
And very successfully. We had 8 senators from the US come to visit a school the other day. They couldn't believe it. They're absolutely speechless when they watch these little kids of age 9 make this beautiful eggplant casserole and a curried pumpkin dish with sunflower seeds on the top, and hummus, and they made chapati. And these are very small kids, and they're all doing it with huge enthusiasm. And we just sort of look on with pride, knowing that they're doing this every week.
It's inspirational. Stephanie, it's lovely to talk to you. Thank you very much.